happy to welcome Steve Palmer. When I was a grad student at Berkeley, he was one of the leaders of the cognitive science program, and so that's where I learned a lot. I was confused. You read things like J.J. Gibson, and he just seemed too mystical, but then I read Steve's stuff, and it all started to make sense. And now I think he's, so he did that for triangles that point and how they group together, and now he seems to be pushing the envelope even farther, and he's going to explain color, music, and emotion for us.
Right.
Take it away, Steve.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about some very recent research, just the last couple of years. But before I talk about color, music, and emotion, I want to give an update. The talk that I gave, I don't know, it was probably maybe 3 years ago or more. And Google actually was kind enough to give me some money to support our research on color preferences. So at the time I gave that talk, I was able to tell you a lot about what colors people liked. They tend to like cool colors, particularly blue. They tend not to like dark yellow, that is to say greenish brown colors. But we didn't know why. And one of the things that we learned, in part with the support from Google, is we now know a lot about why people like the colors they do, at least in aggregate. This is not necessarily each individual person yet. But the basic theory, we call it the ecological valence theory, is that people like colors to the extent that they like the objects that are those colors. So the reason people like blues is because they like clear sky and clean water, and the reason they don't like those, I call that color yucky poo, this dark yellow, is because it looks like yucky poo. And we're able to show this in a pretty elegant and a convincing manner. You can count for 80% of the variance in group data on color preferences from the perspective of the way that we've tested this theory. If you want to find out more about it, there's a paper by Palmer and Schloss in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010. And there's also a video for the visual learners. There's a video that's available if you just Google Palmer Color Stanford video. It's a lecture I gave to Terry Winograd's group. And the first half of that talk will sort of explain that stuff. But today what I'm going to be talking about is color, music, and emotion, and this particular image I've used because maybe some of you at least will recognize this. I don't know whether it's part of the Google Art project or not, but this is a painting by Kandinsky, and Kandinsky was a synesthete. So that when he heard music, he saw colors, and he used those colors to paint and so forth, and there's a number of other artists who have had similar kinds of synesthetic experiences. And this project actually kind of began with the question by an undergraduate about synesthesia. He wanted to study synesthesia in this color seminar that I teach or taught at Berkeley. But we couldn't do that because we don't have any synesthetes in the class, and I was using everybody in the class as subjects for the experiment. So I said, well, what about, let's look at a relationship between color and music in just normal everyday people. That was the genesis of this project. So what I'm going to do today is tell you first about these associations between color and music. First, in an initial experiment that we did where we used orchestral classical music by Bach, Mozart, and Brahms. Then I'm going to tell you about a further extension of that study where we got serious about controlling our stimuli, that's what we call them in psychology, by using single-line piano melodies. Then I'm going to talk about some ways in which we tested this idea that it's actually emotion that mediates the relationship between colors and music. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some work that's related in the sense that it's also about colors and music, but here it's really about individual differences. It's about something that we might call aesthetic style. And the name we give to this dimension where people vary in terms of aesthetic style we call preference for harmony. And I'll explain, where that came from and so forth. So first I want to talk about the initial experiment. And the basic question is, well, are there systematic relationships between color and music? And if so, why do we have them? And the claim that was made by Arnheim, Rudolf Arnheim, famous psychologist of art, was that there are such relationships and they're mediated by emotion. But he didn't provide any evidence for that or say anything about how it might happen, and that's sort of what we're going for. Those are the interesting theoretical questions. So first, to say a few words about the colors that we studied. This is part of the color experiment that I talked to you about 3 years ago. We used colors, 37 colors selected from the natural color system, which has the sort of standard dimensions of color appearance. There's hue, which are the things that we would call the basic colors, including 2 dimensions of red, green, and blue, yellow. There's also the dimension of saturation, how vivid the color is, where all the desaturated colors are along the central axis, and they become more vivid as they go out to the edge. And finally, brightness, which is the vertical height of the color within this space, with black at the bottom, white at the top, and various shades of gray in between. Then the way that we selected our 37 colors was we used 8 different hues, the so-called unique hues, red, green, blue, and yellow. And then also maybe it's better if I actually sit down because I'm blocking people's views. Those are the unique hues, and then the angle bisectors of those unique hues, orange, purple, cyan, and chartreuse. You all know what cyan is. Chartreuse is yellow-green. And then we sampled those 8 hues at 4 different what we call cuts through the color space, which are combinations of saturation and brightness levels. So we have a light cut, which is sort of what you might call the pastel colors, a saturated cut, which are the ones that are most vivid, a muted cut, which have the same overall brightness as the saturated colors, but are less saturated, and finally the dark colors. And you'll see that the light, muted, and dark colors are all pretty much the same in terms of their overall saturation. The only ones that have higher saturation are the saturated sample, plus 5 grays at corresponding levels in between, and that gives us a total of 37 colors that we've been studying. And you'll see how this comes up in the experiments in just a second. Yeah, these don't look quite the way they should, but of course you guys know about that, right? I have no control over this projector. I shouldn't say I have no control. I have limited control over this projector. But this shows where those colors lie in the C-Lab color space. Now, one of the things that we did with these colors in the initial experiment was to show people each square of color and have them make a rating in terms of what the emotional content or emotional association of those colors were. And we did this for a whole lot of different terms, and a subset of those terms are the ones that I'm going to be using today because they seem to apply both potentially to music and color. So we've got angry, calm, sad, happy, dreary, lively, weak, and strong. And what we're showing here is the actual data points for the red, orange, yellow, chartreuse, green, cyan, blue, and purple in these 4 different cuts. So these are the 32 chromatic colors, and of course, the dark red is the angriest color, followed by saturated red and so forth, and then cyans and blues are the least angry color, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a mapping of what the emotional associations of these things are, and we picked these particular 8 to pursue in this study. So the first task we had people do was they listened to 18 different classical music selections, and they chose in order the 5 best colors to go with that music. That's all we told them. And then later on we played the same selections of music and said, okay, now pick the 5 worst colors in order that go least well with the music. And for each of 3 composers, Bach, Mozart, and Brahms, we had this little 2x3 design. We had slow, medium, and fast music, and we had some in a major mode and some in a minor mode. And the Bach pieces were from the Brandenburg Concerti, the Mozart from the late symphonies, and the Brahms from the 4 symphonies. And if I can, I will play a few of these so you get the idea. If you can hear it, I hope you can. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
So that's Bach fast. Oh yeah, that's right. So I tried to fix this morning. I couldn't. It's it's a Microsoft product. Let's get rid of that. So that's the major fast. Here's Bach minor. Many of these will be familiar to you. For contrast, so here's Bach's slow major. So big difference in speed. And here's slow minor. Okay, now a couple others. So Mozart, fast major. Still pretty lively. There's a big difference between fast Brahms and fast Mozart versus Bach, right? So that's a lot slower, but it's really fast for Brahms. Okay, so you get an idea, and you can think about doing the task. So suppose you're hearing this, and your task is to pick the 5 colors in order to go best with this music. I don't know about you, but I'd probably pick the saturated yellow and maybe the white and this light yellow and bright warm colors and so forth. Anyway, so that's what they did. That was their first task. Now I can go back. And then they did 2 other tasks, which are a little bit more straightforward. As I told you, this was the data I showed you before, that we had each person see each one of these colors individually, say that particular color there, which is kind of yucky poo, and say, how happy is that color? How sad, how lively, how dreary, how strong, how weak, and so forth. They made a rating. They actually put a slider. There was a slider at the bottom from, very happy to very not happy, and so forth. So we get data for each color in terms of what its emotional associations are. And the same thing with the music. So they would hear that piece, say this one, and they say how happy it is, how sad it is, blah, 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 okay? Then we computed these what we call color music associations between the colors and the music. And the way that we did it was, remember they do it for the best colors and the worst colors, and basically we just take this weighted average of, for a given dimension, say brightness, how bright are the colors that they pick to go well with it, and we weight them more for the first one they pick versus the second versus the third, and so forth. Those are the most consistent. And we do the same thing for the ones that are most inconsistent, and we just subtract the 2, right? So if it was that piece and you pick bright colors, then you'd have a large number here minus a negative number here, which gives you a very large number relative to other ones that you might pick. So it's a way of integrating those 2 sets of choices that they make. And then we looked here at, we're plotting then what the saturation is of the colors that people pick to go with the slow, medium, and fast tempo and the major and minor mode. And this is just averaged across Bach, Mozart, and Brahms. Okay. And what you find is, these are huge effects. I mean, that as the music gets faster, the colors get more saturated. And if music is major as opposed to minor, the colors are still more saturated. And similarly for light versus dark, the faster the music is, the lighter the colors are, and the more major it is, the lighter they are. There's not much going on for red versus green. But in blue versus yellow, again, the colors that they pick to go with the faster music and the more major music are yellower than the colors that they pick to go with the slower and more minor music. And all of these things are sort of wildly significant. Well, that's interesting. There really are very systematic relationships between color and music. We didn't really know whether we were going to get anything to come out there, but it did. And in some sense, the thing that was most remarkable about this study is that we then went back and we looked at people's ratings for each piece of music. How, say, happy versus sad is this piece of music? Okay, and they made a rating on this thing. And we also had to make a rating of how happy versus sad the colors are that went with the music, the colors that they picked to go with the music. So we can actually look at the correlation between the happy sadness of the music and the happy sadness of the colors that they picked to go with the music. You with me? And what we found was, remarkably, the correlation between the happy sadness of the music and the happy sadness of the colors is 0.97. And similarly for strong versus weak, 0.96, lively dreary, 0.99, calm angry, 0.89. So this is like the flakiest experiment I think I've ever heard anybody do. You play people these uncontrolled musical excerpts, you show them this array of 32 colors, 37 colors, you have them pick the ones that go best, the ones that pick that go worst. Moreover, and then you ask them about how emotional, what kind of emotions they had, these things have, and you get correlations like this. I spent many sleepless nights wondering if there wasn't something in the experimental design that ensured that this was going to come out this way, but there isn't. So what this meant to us was that, we believe that emotion is mediating this relationship between color and music.
Did the same people do the color music associations as did the emotional?
Yes, and very different parts of the... This was a group of 48 subjects that we had come in and do about 32 different tasks over a period of several weeks. They didn't do those things on the same day. And I think they did the color music stuff first, and then they did the... I don't remember whether they did the color emotion or the music emotion stuff second or third, but yes, they all did. It's the same, very same subjects. Yeah.
Were the subjects all undergrads or grads?
No, this was actually a sample of paid subjects. Some were undergraduates, but actually they're half men, half women, half highly trained in color. We actually had painters, graphic designers, interior decorators in the sort of sophisticated group based on how much training they had in art and color and things like that. So it's actually a 2x2 with 12 subjects in each. So it's not standard, but it doesn't really matter because the other data, some of the other data I'll show you, I think, are from undergraduates. You get the same thing. Okay, so this is what we think is happening. You listen to the music, you have some emotional, I think you have some emotional reaction to it. You might just say, well, you just have emotional associations to the music or whatever, and then you pick the colors that go with that music, that emotion. Well, how might this happen? We've got some more data from this experiment that we can use to shed some light on this. So for each pair of colors, we have their ratings of how it loads onto each of these 8 emotional terms, right? How happy, sad, lively, dreary, blah, 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 blah. So for each pair of colors, we can correlate the ratings that the people gave to them in terms of those emotional dimensions. And then we can use those correlations as the input to a multidimensional scaling program. People know what multidimensional scaling is? Yeah, okay. So, and we come out with a really nice, this is a color space, but it's not a color space based on color appearance. It's a color space that's based on color emotions, if you will. And you get a good fit with 2 dimensions, which apparently seem to be more or less happy versus sad colors and weak versus strong colors. So the saturated colors tend to be over here, and the desaturated colors over here, and the sort of warmer colors up here, and the cooler colors down there. Then you can do the very same thing. So you can predict 84% of the variance in terms of how happy versus sad the colors are, in terms of how saturated versus desaturated they are, and how light versus dark they are. This is just a multiple regression analysis. 84%, that's pretty darn good. Not quite so good at predicting strong versus weak. Only 60% of the variance. That's still a multiple or a correlation of 0.8. But saturated colors and dark colors tend to be stronger, and desaturated and lighter colors tend to be weaker. Now you can do the same thing with the music, because of course we have the same data for each of the selections of music. They've rated each piece of music in terms of how happy, sad, lively, dreary, strong, weak, blah, blah, blah. And you can then correlate those, each pair, and you can do a music emotion space. And so this gives you the key here. So let's see. Yellow is fast and open is major. So here are the fast major pieces up here. They're strong and happy, relatively speaking. And here are the solid ones are slow. And the blue ones rather are slow and open. So these are the slow minor ones down here. So the 2 dimensions seem to be pretty much the same. Happy, sad, strong, weak. I mean, it's as though what your brain is doing is mapping the music into this emotion space which is the same space that into which colors get mapped. And you can actually kind of read off of these two things. We just sort of superimpose them. Okay, if I'm listening to this piece of music, the colors that are most similar to that are in this emotion space, and that seems to be what they pick. This is just more multiple regressions. And so at the end of this experiment, we've got a very robust mapping between this kind of music, at least, and these particular colors. And we've got a hypothesis that is actually mediated by people's emotions in a mind-blowingly tightly coupled way. So this isn't the next thing chronologically that we did, but sort of conceptually, this is data that we just recently collected with Thomas Langlois, who is right there in the green sweater. Raise your hand, Thomas. And we wanted to get some control over these things. I mean, the music that we used was real music. I mean, these were commercially available recordings, the best I could find. But there's all kinds of variation in terms of how loud and soft things. We studied tempo and mode, major versus minor. You know, maybe it's not really major versus minor and tempo that matters. Maybe it's a lot of these other things. So we wanted to go to another kind of music that was much more well controlled, and so we ended up using Mozart solo piano music, where it's only a melody, it's only a one-note thing played always on the piano in every case. So so what are some of the things that we control by doing this? Dynamics, there's no loud versus soft. This was actually a synthesized piano, so there was no variation in dynamics. There's no difference in orchestration or tonal color, timbre, or harmonic mode. There's no harmony in it. But what we did vary were on these four piano. I'm going to have to switch out of here because this won't work either. These four, we picked theme and variation melodies by Mozart, where he actually, because we wanted slow versus fast, not just in terms of what the overall tempo is, but also in terms of the note rate. And a theme and variation, what they usually or often do is there's a slow version and there's a fast version where they interpolate notes in between. I'll give you an example of that. So here's one of the, I'll just do one of the major and one of the minor. And it goes on, it's not just that bit, but, and here's one of the minor ones. This is a different one. Now, for each of these, we have them in both major and minor mode. So we actually wrote a minor version of the major ones and major version of the minor ones. But these are the two, I believe, am I right about this? That the first two were the ones, that these were the ones that Mozart wrote in major and we transposed. That's right. And these were the ones that we, Mozart wrote in minor because we wanted to have both of those things. We never looked at that. We haven't looked at that yet. But these are like I said, very new data. So what did we vary? Let's play this one again. Oh, you haven't heard this before. Okay, so now here's the minor version of the same thing. Okay, here's when we change the tempo. This is just speeding it up. Okay. We also changed pitch height, that is higher and lower octaves. I think this is lower. And here's note density. So this is the variation. Now the beat here is the same as it was before, but now there's two notes for every one note that you had before. And that's what this diagram is supposed to be showing you over here. This is the variation. It's got these extra notes in between. And the rate at which the notes come at you are the same when you've got the variation played slowly and when you've got the original melody played fast, because we speed it up by a factor of 2. So that way we can find out whether it's actually the tempo that matters or the note density or just the note rate. Okay? It turns out to be the note rate that matters. All right, back to the slides. What did we find? So we've got more control over more variables, and it might be that everything goes away. We computed those same indices, except this time we only had people pick the best 3 colors instead of the best 5 colors. You can actually get most of the variance with just 2 colors, and of course 1 color is best of all, but you don't lose much, if anything, in looking at 3 colors. So what do we find? Well, here's the yellow versus blueness, yellow up the top, blue at the bottom. The yellow blueness of the colors that they picked to go with the slow, medium, and fast. This is in terms of the note rate. And you can see that increases as a function of note rate. And it also increases more yellow colors for major and also more yellow colors for the notes in the higher register. Okay? And this shows you down here the multiple regression. So you can account for 74% of the yellow blueness of the colors that they picked to go with a given piece of music just by looking at how fast it is, whether it's major or minor, and whether it's in the upper or lower register. And similarly, for light dark, different pattern here, but same features, right? Major versus minor, higher and faster, but much bigger differences between them in terms of how light versus dark the colors are that picked to go with them. Saturation, again, here there's a difference between major and minor and a difference between faster and slower, but there's no difference in the saturation of the colors that they picked based on whether it's the higher or lower register. So we're actually getting very sort of well-articulated results in this incredibly flaky task in terms of what's the nature of the mapping between colors and music, where certain dimensions show up in certain kinds of color dimensions, certain musical dimensions show up and don't in others. And red-green basically there's kind of nothing much going on there again, like before. So, so we're getting a replication in which we're showing now that it's not all of those other things. It really is the speed, in particular the note rate, that matters, and whether it's in major or minor mode also matters for some color dimensions, whether it's a higher or lower register, but not for all color dimensions. So we've replicated our result with much better controlled stimuli, and now we can go back and look at those correlations, because we can do the same thing we did before, because we got people to make ratings for each color and each musical piece. And I think this was done, Thomas, wasn't it, with undergraduates more or less? Yeah. Yeah. So we rated. They had them rate, each of the pieces of music in terms of its emotional content. Then we correlated them, and then we got this multidimensional scaling, which is ridiculously regular. So you can see what we've got over here. We've got the minor stuff, or the blues. The major ones are the reds, okay? And then this other dimension is a combination of speed, slow versus fast, and also low versus high register. So minor, slow, low, minor, slow, high, minor, medium, low, and there's 2 of these, and then there's the high registers and so forth. Very, very regular systematic mapping. And we do the same kind of thing with the colors, and we get another emotional multidimensional scaling of the colors in terms of their emotions. So the dark colors are over here, light colors are over here, by and large desaturated ones down here, saturated ones up here. And these also map onto strong, weak, and happy, sad, the same 2 emotional dimensions that we got before. So in a conceptual sense, it's a full, complete replication of what we did before with much better controlled and very different kinds of stimuli. What about those correlations? Okay, so here we're looking at the happy sadness of the melodies and the happy sadness of the colors people pick to go with them. And once again, very high correlations, not quite as high, 0.92, 0.82. Now, strong versus weak is down to only 63% of the variance, but that makes a lot of sense, because I think a lot of the strong, weak kinds of emotional content of music is going to be carried by dynamics. How loud is it? How soft is it? And we've stripped all that stuff out. Also probably tonal color. So one of the things eventually we want to get to is to sort of add some of those things back in. One of my collaborators in the future on this stuff is Dan Levitin, who's a music cognition guy up at Toronto, and he's actually got data where he has had...
McGill.
I'm sorry, McGill, yes, you're right. Where he has a pianist playing full piano pieces with emotional expression, and then they can morph out the dynamics and so forth and show that you get less emotion. So we can add them back in some sense and see, when you add them back in, does then that pump up the correlation between strong, weak, and so forth?
So that might hold for the note rate versus the beat,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you play more expressively, you can emphasize the beat more.
Yeah, now we don't know, I have to say, we don't know at this point what people's perception of the beat is.
Yeah.
We're going by what's written. So, and when you start doing the variations where the notes start coming at a faster rate, it may be that people start to think that it's a faster tempo. So we haven't done that yet. As I say, this is very new data. Okay, so this sort of view still seems to hold up, that we think people are evaluating the emotional content of the music and they're mapping it to the colors. But of course, this is all correlational data. Maybe that's not what it is. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe there's some, other way of thinking about it. But our thinking was we could actually test the theory that it's actually mediated by emotion, because that implies that you could do the very same thing with anything else that's got emotional content, that's got these dimensions: happy, sad, strong, weak, angry. So what we decided to do was to look at color face associations and color gesture associations. Because the faces, it was the same face in just different emotional configurations. This is just that. Okay, yeah, so that's what we're going to do. Yeah, okay. So these are the faces. We use one male face, one female face. These guys are the neutral ones. Then there was the happy one, the sad one, the angry one of the male and female, and then there was a morphed one in between that we call 50%, but it's not actually, you didn't tell people to say do a 50% smile. You had them do the happy thing, and then they morphed between that and the neutral one. And the deal is that our subjects will be looking at each one of these faces, and then they'll be picking the colors that go best with that face. Okay? And they get the same thing. They get the face again later and the ones that go worst with it. We do the same set of tasks. This is the color face association task. Again, rate the emotional content of the colors, the emotional content of the faces. We do the same analyses that we did before. I think I'm probably not going to go through this in any detail. Oops. But just show you, actually there are error bars of this, so you can see these things are wildly significant differences. That people pick lighter colors to go with the happier faces and darker colors to go with the sad and particularly the angry faces. Saturation, they pick highly saturated colors for the happy faces and desaturated colors for the sad ones, and et cetera, et cetera. Very robust differences. What we're really interested in here is if we go then back and do the correlations, do we find the same kinds of correlations? Okay, so we're looking now at the happy sadness of the face versus the the angry calmness of the face versus the angry calmness of the colors that people pick to go with them. And the correlation is 0.93, and happy sad is 0.97, and weak strong is 0.91. Same thing. So I don't see how this could not be mediated by emotion, given that you do get essentially the same result in this sense when you're doing it with faces that only differ in the emotional content of the expression. So we did one more just to be, with gestures. So this was actually Karen Schloss, one of my graduate students, with a face kind of blanked out, doing expressions: neutral, angry, happy, sad, and so forth. And we asked people to do the same task, pick the 5 best, or 3 best probably, and the 3 worst. And again, we get very systematic differences. Just to go kind of through it, this is the color gesture association for how light versus dark the colors are. So the happy gestures get light colors picked for it, whereas the angry, disgusted, and sad ones get dark, and so forth. The high saturation for happy, more yellow for happy, and so forth. But not everything varies, but very sort of selective things vary, and it varies quite systematically. And this is not with huge numbers of subjects either. You can do this. You can do these experiments with like 15 to 20 subjects and get sensible results. And here are then these emotional correlations. Happy versus sad, angry, disgusted, calm. All of them above 0.9 except for calm, which is not too surprising given it hasn't got a whole lot of quite as much content to it. So we think that this pretty much nails down. The one thing we haven't done yet is it implies that you don't have to be colors. So far, we've only done things with colors. We should be able to have people play the music for the people and have them pick the face that goes with the music, right? Or the gesture that goes with the music. Any pair of dimensions. I mean, so the general claim, which I firmly believe, is that any pair of cross-modal domains that have common emotional content can be mapped into each other in very regular ways, at least within, U.S. culture probably. But we'll get, I wish I had data yet, but actually I'm going to be asking probably for some more money from you guys to help us extend this stuff. But I want to talk about this last thing, which is this preference for harmony, individual differences in terms of preference for harmony, which started out with color and has morphed into music and a bunch of other things. The initial experiments, in addition to studying people's preferences for individual colors, Karen Schloss and I did experiments looking at how much people like pairs of colors. And there's a paper out in Attention, Perception, and Performance about this past year. So we got for each subject, they would move the slider, how much do you like this pair of colors? But we had also got them to make references of what we called harmony. And we said, okay, also rate how harmonious these colors are, and or very much to not at all. And of course, what does harmony mean? We say, well, how well do these colors go together? Now, we did tell them one more thing. We said, it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as how much you like them. It's like in music. In music, everyone would agree that Mozart, or almost everyone would agree that Mozart is more harmonious than Stravinsky. Some people like Mozart, some people like Stravinsky. People get it. They seem to understand that because they don't necessarily give us the same ratings for harmony as they do for color, and we're going to see that those are very systematic in particularly, I think, surprising ways. So when we did this particular experiment for color pairs, this is what the data looked like for just for the color pairs when there are people rating how much they like the color pairs. Okay, so this corresponds to the color of the little square in the center, the figural color, and this color corresponds, the different curves correspond to the color of the ground on the ground. This is averaged over those cuts. But one of the things that you notice right off the bat, it's very complex data in some sense, but there's a very strong regularity in that people like the blue figures to be on blue grounds and the chartreuse figures to be on chartreuse grounds more than the other ones. There's this gradient along the hue dimension away from the same hue, but they like the colors that have the same hues best. Okay? Very strong. You can actually account for, what does it say? I think it's about 62%. Oh no, it's on this one. So these are the data for people's ratings of how harmonious the color pairs are. And notice you get exactly the same thing, but it's like it's been amplified, right? The data are very much more systematic across individuals for how harmonious the colors are than they are for how much they like the colors, which is what you would expect. It's like saying most people believe that Mozart is more harmonious than Stravinsky, but some people like Mozart, some people like Stravinsky. There's more agreement in terms of these ratings of harmony, and that's just pointing out what I showed you before. And the correlation between the harmony data and the preference data is 0.79. That's very, very, very high. Okay? And you might think that means, well, everybody likes harmonious colors, but that's not true. We didn't believe that. This just shows you what the data look like for, we had 992 different color pairs, and we looked at, this is plotting the average harmony rating for each of these color combinations against the average preference rating. You can see the correlation. And you can also see what really matters. They like the cool colors, the blues and purples and things are up here. The reds and oranges are down here. They're less harmonious. They're also less preferred. And the higher contrast things tend to be higher up. So these guys are not terribly preferred colors, but there's nice contrast there. These are more preferred colors, but there's less contrast there. Anyway, that's sort of neither here nor there. The interesting thing, and the work that I've been doing with Will Griscom, who's going to raise his hand now, yes, is looking at this across different domains and across different people. The idea being, it turns out, I mean, you know, I'm a Gestalt psychologist, and I had already, when I started doing this work on aesthetics and color and so forth, I'd already done a bunch of work on people's perception of complexity in shapes and a bunch of different things, all of which it seemed like, well, everybody has preferences in almost everything. And then on all these different domains, there was this other dimension, which was sort of how simple, how regular, how harmonious, how well do things go together, which is related to some of my interest in grouping that Peter mentioned before. So we wanted to look and see whether this preference for harmony, as we call it, held up across individuals, because of course we can do for each individual what I showed you before, look at the correlation between their rating of each of the 992 color pairs in terms of how much they like it versus how harmonious they think it is. Okay? And when you do that, then you find out that there's a huge range of preference for harmony across individuals. This is the number of people whose correlations fell in each of these bins. Interestingly, even the one person with the highest correlation has a lower correlation than the group data does. What's happening here is that there's basically, at least in terms of this talk, there's kind of two components to the preference stuff, one of which is based on something that sort of everybody shares, which is their reaction to harmony. And then there's all kinds of other idiosyncratic things that happen that sort of reduce that correlation. When you average across people, you're averaging out those idiosyncratic variations. And the signal that remains is really the one that's driven primarily by how harmonious the colors are. This just shows you a few disharmonious color combinations and a few harmonious ones. So, actually, Karen and I looked at this variation, trying to understand it, and the thing that sort of came out as being most relevant and most robust was a relationship between people's preference for harmony and the amount of training that they'd had in color theory. Because remember, this is a group that, this particular group included a bunch of painters and graphic artists and interior designers and so forth. And so we broke it down in terms of this sort of 5-point scale in terms of the amount of formal color training, and you get this curvilinear relationship where people who have virtually no training have only a very weak preference for harmony. People who have a moderate amount actually have a pretty substantial preference for harmony, but the people who have the most training actually have a much reduced preference for harmony. Now, notice there's different numbers of subjects in each of these groups, which is why some of these error bars are pretty big. But it gives you the idea that there's maybe a relationship between this preference for harmony measurement and the amount of training people have in a given field. But the real question, I don't have time to animate it. The real question is whether this is a sort of stable trait of a person. Traits may be the wrong word. A stable aspect of a person, something that we might call being part of their aesthetic style, where if you, say, like harmonious colors, maybe you like Mozart better than Stravinsky. Maybe you like simple, regular figures. And these are the 4 different domains that we used. I think the next slide. This makes a point here. In addition to asking about how much you like different color compositions or pattern compositions or spatial compositions, you can ask about this other dimension, which we're calling harmony generically because it sounds nice. And you actually call it harmony in color, and you call it harmony in music. In these patterns, you typically call it figural goodness. That's a translation of a German word that the Gestalt psychologists use that's related to simplicity. And in spatial composition, I'll show you the task that we use, and we call it goodness of fit. Those are the words that we use to get people to rate these other dimensions. And so those are the 4 domains. So with the very same set of subjects, we have them do color harmony task as well as a color preference task with pairs of colors. Spatial fit, the spatial fit task is there's a single dot inside of a rectangle. It could be at any one of 35 different positions. We ask them to say, in addition to how much you like the position of that dot within the frame, how well does it fit within the frame, okay? And the reason for this is because we're also doing research on the spatial composition of images, and we find a lot of interesting regularities there that seem to be related to this kind of measure. We also use these dot patterns that were developed by a guy named Wendell Garner, ones that have low figural goodness, that is, are asymmetrical versus ones that are symmetrical, and also musical harmony. So there were 14 different piano clips. This is not quite as loud. Can you hear it? And it doesn't come much simpler than that. That's like a kid's exercise, right? Hello? Oh. Well, you have to hear this. So this is the other end of the scale. Oh. It's Schoenberg, and it sounds absolutely...
I've been wanting to say, where's the Schoenberg throughout this entire talk.
Pardon?
I've been wanting to say, where's the Schoenberg?
Yeah, here it is, but for some reason it's not... what have I got? What have I got?
Harmonious.
There we go. Not so harmonious. Okay. So, and what we've got, what we've got over here on the right-hand side then is, oh geez, I didn't want to do that. So what we've got here is the average correlation and then the range of correlations. The average correlation for these were undergraduates, between the harmoniousness of the color pairs and how much they liked them was 0.96, very high. But the range was from 0.4 to 0.94. For these dots within the frame, the overall correlation is 0.94, but the range was from 0.09 to 0.83. Still all positive, these are all positive. Here, for the figure of goodness, we actually find a lower correlation, and we find that some of them go negative, that some people actually like systematically the less harmonious ones. And for the musical harmony, correlation of 0.97, again, all of them are positive. But there's a substantial range, and the question is, are these things systematic across domains? Are the people who like the most harmonious color combinations the one who like the more harmonious kinds of music? So what Will and I did then was to compute for each of these pairs of domains a difference between their preference and harmony ratings in that domain, and then look at how well those correlated across pairs. So this is the color task versus the frame task. Okay, and the correlation is 0.4. Color versus shape, it's 0.55. Color versus music is 0.65. It's crazy high. I mean, for a task like this, this is in some ways even crazier than the experiments that I told you before. And to get a correlation that's high, when typically individual difference correlations, they tend to get excited when it's about 0.3, right? So these are all positive, and all of them are significant at the 0.01 or better level, except for the frame versus music. So there seems to be something systematic about this. And moreover, it does seem to be modulated by the kind of training that people get. So in this experiment, we had subjects that were drawn from 3 different majors: psychology, music, and art. And then we looked at, this is the average correlation, the average preference for harmony correlation for the different subjects. And what you see is that for the psychology subjects, it's highest for the psychology subjects in each domain. Now remember, preference for harmony is something that's going to tend to decrease. Well, it's got this curvilinear relationship, so you don't know exactly where people are, but from this data. But the people who are sort of expert in a given domain should have lower preference for harmony, and that's exactly what you find. So the art students have lowest preference for harmony among the 3 groups in all 3 of these different tasks that are related to sort of visual aesthetics. And the music students have the lowest preference for harmony in music. And in each case, the let's call them the sort of artistic group, and the other domain is intermediate between the two. So there's the art students, the music and psychology, art, music, psychology, art, music, psychology, and here is music, art, psychology. So we don't know quite why, there's clearly training effects. We don't know exactly why we're getting this pattern. It might be that there's just sort of self-selection. The people who tend to go into the arts in general tend to have an aesthetic style where they tend to like things that are less harmonious, more interesting and so forth. It might be that. Or it might be that they get a certain amount or more cross-disciplinary interaction, and they actually, you know, are more likely to go to an art museum if you're a musician, or more likely to go to a concert if you're a visual artist or something like that. We can't really parcel that stuff out yet. But we're working on models to try to understand the underlying structure of these data in terms of different factors. There seems to be clear evidence that there's a general factor of preference for harmony that goes through these things. It actually explains some very old data by a guy named Eysenck, who claimed that there was a general factor that he called good taste. And really what that amounts to is somebody who has good taste is somebody who likes the harmonious stuff, because when you average across everybody, that's the signal that comes out, right? And that, you know, obviously it's not the world's greatest conclusion, but in any case, so just this morning, right before I came out, I just thought I should write down a few of the kinds of directions that we're going with this. One of them, obviously, is we're going to look at cross-cultural studies of music, and we actually have some data from Mexico on the classical music. But the other thing we want to do, which is much more interesting, is to try to look at culturally specific music. So gamelan music in Malaysia, and mariachi bands in Mexico, and brass folk bands in Serbia, and so forth. We have collaborations in the Color Project with all of those places, also Japanese collaborators and so forth. So we have a kind of naturally set up thing where we can look at some of these things, both with classical music and with these other kinds of music. One thing I mentioned during the talk, we've got, you know, you strip it down to just a single line of piano music, and you can find these relationships between color and music. We want to sort of start adding some of those things back in, add back in dynamics and harmonic mode to go back toward, and also tonal color. Look at difference between the same thing being played on piano versus cello versus clarinet, and so forth. And we want to look at other kinds of visual domains. So we, in particular, in my mind, I mean, one of the sort of images is like, you know, Fantasia, right? You take music and you want to create a visual display that seems to go with this music, and we've already looked at some of the things that influence that, and we're doing other things. We've done stuff with line shape already. We're doing some stuff with textures and so forth, and we want to get into motion if we can, and that's a ... There's all kinds of other stuff there as well. An extension to color combinations. This is something that Will is working on. So if you look at not single colors, which is what we've looked at so far, but combinations of colors, pairs, or mondrians of different colored things, and what about how does that map onto, say, consonance, dissonance in music? So if you've got an interval that's a major second versus a minor third versus a major fifth or whatever, do you get the kinds of expected relationships between color and musical structure there, and so forth? This thing that started out as one little class project has now exploded into this, you know, multinational collaboration with other people doing color and music and all kinds of stuff. So finally, I just want to say thank you to everybody that's been working in our lab. This is really everybody, but these are the people that are most connected to the Color and Music project, and to our sponsors, which include NSF and Google. And I have to say, before NSF and Google were interested in this thing, our actual main sponsor for the initial studies was Amy's Natural Frozen Food. We paid our subjects with coupons for frozen pizzas from Amy's. They're pretty darn good, and I will be forever indebted to them for having funded the early stages of this project. Thank you all for your attention.
All these results are very fascinating, but the thing that I found most interesting, which you haven't really talked about, is the fact that you've got this correlation in yellow-blue space, but you don't have it in red and green space. And the only reason I come up with for why that might be is because the blue-yellow portion of our visual system evolved first and might be somehow evolutionary related to the development of emotions as well. And I was wondering what kind of experiment you could possibly run to get at that kind of...
This is the question, is why are those associations between colors and emotions there? And you mentioned, there could be some biologically based thing that's sort of hardwired into our system because blue-yellow is an older piece of the visual system than the red-green piece. I tend not to believe that. I tend toward much more ecological explanations. When I started out, I talked about this color preference work that we've done, where we looked at, blue, yellow, red, green in terms of, early visual connections and stuff like that, and that does not account for the data nearly as well as these associations people have between objects and colors. And now there's a really appealing ecological story there, that what you want in preferences is you want a steering mechanism for an organism. You want the preferences that the organism has to lead them toward good stuff and away from bad stuff. So in taste, for example, we like sweet, fatty tasting things, which tend to have a lot of calories in them and are therefore good for surviving and reproducing. And we tend not to like bitter and sour things, which are more likely to be toxic or poisonous. So the taste system presumably has evolved because of these correlations between certain kinds of taste and what's good for you and certain kinds of taste and what's bad for you. And that comes out in the color data. That's the way we tested it. It turns out that the blue stuff, the cool color stuff, when you ask people to list all the objects that are that color, and then you have another group of subjects come and just rate how much do you like clear sky. You don't show them any pictures, there's nothing colored about it. And that actually predicts almost all of the variance in the group data. So I think that an ecological explanation is more likely to be the case, that it probably has something to do with yellow, the sun being yellow, and the sun is warm, and so I like that. It's a warm thing. I don't think that it's probably an angry. Angry, for example, I showed you the data for angry. It's really a sort of generalization gradient away from one color, away from red. So I think it's really related to the ecological salience of somebody's face being red and blood and things like that, that's related to anger, not to, early versus late biological systems. That's my hypothesis. We don't yet have terribly compelling evidence for it. But the question is really important, that why do we have these associations between emotions and colors? It's not so much specifically just about blue versus yellow shows up in music and red versus green doesn't, because there's other kinds of emotional stuff that does show up for red versus green, like anger, for example. So it's not that they're not emotional colors, it's just that they're not emotions that seem to show up that much in music, at least in music we use. Maybe other music that does. Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the significance of emotion here. So in your talk, you have shown that emotion is a good subspace to map color and music and study the correlations between them.
Mm-hmm.
But did this come out post facto, like the empirical evidence, or did you have a hunch that emotion is a good space? Like I could have
we had to have had a hunch, because we did the experiment with the same subjects. We designed this huge study with 32 different tasks. We not only had them picking the colors that went with the music, we also had them rating the colors and the music in terms of these emotional domains. So yes, we had a hunch. But my guess is, as with most hunches, my guess is that it came from introspection and intuition about what might be going on.
I mean, if it were me, I would have been between using emotion or food or wine to choose as a subspace for color and music. I mean, why emotion? I mean, it could be something else.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it wasn't that we tried all possibilities and this is what showed up. It's because that seemed to be the driving factor when we did the task and seemed to be something systematic in the data. There were previous versions, like I said, that actual first experiment was a tweak and a much better done version of a class project that was done in my color seminar. Before we actually knew how to analyze the data and things like that, you already could see that there seemed to be something systematic about the colors and the music in terms of emotion. But yeah, so it's a combination of the two. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you could go back in time 40 years and do these experiments, and I suspect your graphs might change in interesting ways. Like in the 70s when people preferred the poo colors, like the oranges and the browns. And,
okay, so there's lots of interesting things to say about that.
The larger question is, how much does the culture influence our preferences, and how much is innate?
Well, we don't know the answer about culture for the color music associations. We don't actually even have any data yet. We do know something about cultural influences and historical influences on color preferences. So, culturally speaking, I can't really explain this very well without having given the talk about color preferences, because there's a particular way that we compute these numbers based on people's ratings of how much they like all of these objects, all these colored objects. But you can do the same procedure in the US and do that procedure, we call it the WAVE, the Weighted Affective Valence Estimate. You can do the WAVE in America and you can get American preferences. You can do the WAVE in Japan and get Japanese preferences. And then the prediction is that the American wave should correlate higher with the American preferences than the Japanese preferences, and the Japanese wave should correlate higher with the Japanese preferences with the American preferences, and that's true. We actually even have data showing the similar kind of thing in terms of individual differences. If you take a whole bunch of people and you do a hierarchical clustering and you look at because the data on this is very noisy at the individual level. If you get the two largest groups of subjects that have been clustered based on liking similar kinds of colors, and then you do this wave procedure, you find the same thing, that the wave for group 1 predicts group 1's data better than group 2's and vice versa. So, so there are variations, and they do seem to be across cultures and across individuals, and at least in the case of color preferences, they do seem to be consistent with this ecological story I'm telling, because, I mean, I may love broccoli, you may hate broccoli, you might dislike all green vegetables. Well, the prediction is that then, your preference for green is going to be lower than it would be otherwise, if there were a U prime that, had the same other things but liked all the green vegetables, that person would like green better than you do. I can't do that experiment, but there are various, related things that we can do and have started to do and do seem to be panning out. Historically, we're doing an experiment. We haven't gotten the full set of data yet, but we're looking at the same people's color preferences 4 times during the year. Summer, fall, winter, spring, not here, in New England, where there is a difference. And we are getting systematic differences. Now, we haven't analyzed the data yet, so I can't say exactly what they are. But the most interesting, I think, and story about historical things is there's actually an historian, French historian, who's done an analysis of the color blue historically from, ancient times to the present. And the interesting thing that he discovered is that in ancient Rome, I believe, that blue was the least favorite color. I mean, if you look at our data for US, Britain, Mexico, Japan, Serbia, and India, blue is the favorite color in all of them, okay? And you would think, well, everybody loves blue. How could you have a culture in which blue is not the favorite color, right? And here it is, it's the least favorite color. According to its uses in the culture and blah, 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 blah. Well, it turns out the probable reason is that the two main enemies of ancient Rome were the Celts in the north and somebody in the east, both of whom had, for which blue was a favorite color. The Celts even painted their faces and bodies blue when they went into battle, or so I'm told. So it's a matter of, it's still an ecological story. It's like, I hate the Celts and the Celts love blue, therefore I hate blue. We've actually studied that very issue in color preferences with not the Celts and the Romans, but with Stanford and Berkeley undergraduates around big game time. And what we showed is that Berkeley students like blue and gold better on average than Stanford students do, and Stanford students like red and white better on average than Berkeley students do. And for pairs of colors, blue on yellow or yellow on blue and red on white and so forth, the differences are astronomical. And moreover, we show that there's a strong positive correlation around 0.5 between a person's self-rated school spirit and how much more they like their own school colors than the other school's colors. So the objects that are in the mix for determining how much you like colors are not just physical objects, but they're social objects as well. And the idea is that if you're positively invested in a social institution that's strongly associated with a particular color, in the case of Google, it's a lot of colors, primary colors in particular and so forth, then you're going to tend to like those colors more.
So can you tease apart the liking versus just familiarity?
That's a lot tougher.
Yeah.
In some of the cases, it turns out there's also asymmetries in terms of spatial organization. So people like yellow against blue better than they like blue against yellow background. And that does not seem to be, it doesn't seem to be driven by the Berkeley, preference thing, because we find the same data in other cultures. But we do think it's ecologically driven. In other words, we're doing experiments. I think it's actually because of the sun against the blue sky. I think that's it's a generalization of that. People don't know that that's what's doing it, but I think that it is, because if you actually, instead of making a square on a square, if you make it a circle on a rectangle where it looks like a picture of a sun, that you get a bigger effect and a bunch of other things like that. So we're interested in these things, and there are trends that take place in cultures. Some of them are sort of determined by self-perpetuating, is not the right word, it's self-fulfilling prophecies. There are companies, which maybe you guys know about, there are companies that do, that prophesy what the colors are that are going to be, in fashion next year are going to be. What do? Well, they come up with these colors. Karen Schloss, my collaborator, worked for one. They come up with these palettes of colors that are going to be the next big thing, and then they sell them to the industry. Wow. So, but there certainly are these trends. Avocado used to be a big thing back in the 70s. My mother did her kitchen in avocado, and it went away for a while, but it's back now in wasabi. It's a brighter yellow-green, but it's still yellow-green, which is the least preferred hue. Not the least preferred color, because that belongs to these sort of fecal colors. Yucky poo that the dark yellows and dark oranges. But yeah, so there are these sort of historical trends, some of which are driven by these industries, others of which may be driven by other things, I don't know. We're going to do a study in Germany where and Germans have this interesting flag with black and yellow and red in it, and in a town that's right next to a U.S. Army base, where I think the relationship between the town and the Army base is not so great. Army guys, really, they should like those yucky colors, right? Those are the colors of all of their uniforms. So we're going to look at the people's preferences for colors as a function of whether they live in the town or whether they're members of the Army, and their self-rated, spirit for the Army or attitude toward the U.S. and things like that. We don't have any data on that, but that's something. Yeah.
So you've mentioned Schoenberg and Gamelan, which were two of the examples that sprang to mind that I wanted to try out. Mm-hmm. Two more are PDQ Bach and actually Ortico is what I thought.
Why PDQ Bach?
What happens if the music is performed in a funny way? or it's performed with really, really irritating instruments, sawing pieces of metal up. So
That's a
you
timbral.
force an
That's a sort of a
emotional-
timbral thing, yeah.
Yeah, so you force emotional content, emotional reactions onto people
Yeah.
that are independent of what the melody might be doing.
And we haven't looked, I shouldn't say we haven't looked, we have looked and haven't found kind of systematic relationships between people's preferences for the colors and their preferences for the music. We haven't looked real hard at that, but it's clearly something that we can do. And I think when you start getting into stuff like irritatingness and things like that you might find preferences starting to map over, but we haven't found it yet. And there it's much more complicated because, of course, people's preferences are, can only do that on a sort of individual.
And I buy records that I
Person.
listen to and then go, oh God, why do I buy this? And then I do it again. So
Oh, why do you do it
there's
again?
something complicated going on there.
Yeah, some of the early instrument recordings, I think, of the music repertoire were a bit like that. It's kind of violent, but they're getting much better at it.
Yoko Ono music.
Yeah. Oh, Yoko Ono. Yeah.
I was gonna say, the one example you gave personally, where you were playing a clip of music and talked about which colors you thought would go with it, as an example. I was listening to the clip. The first thing that I heard were the horns, and you picked the color of the horns. You said it's bright yellow, and I'm thinking out of all the ones on the thing that make me think of what a trumpet looks like. I have no idea if this is.
Yeah.
I don't mean to pick on.
That.
I don't mean to pick
one of
on
the things
you,
we're finding is that everything seems to matter, and you've got all sorts of associations in your head, and it might be that something like that actually comes through. Now, it's also true that horns, in particular, tend to have a bright sound,
Right.
and yellow is the brightest hue, and so forth. I don't know. You'd have to look and see. I mean, clarinets are black, and
I didn't see a lot of violent colors up there. I guess I was just trying to ask, do you think that the correlation between, so maybe trumpets look that color and sound brighter and are used for loud and vibrant and have a happy feel, does that contribute to yellow being a happy color? Is it coincidence? Do you have any opinion on?
Well, we have done some sort of pilot data, trying to get people to do this ecological valence kind of thing with colors. So instead of having them, they one of the things they do is they see a color and they say the names of all the things that they can think of that are that color, descriptions of them, so ripe banana, noonday sun, urine, da 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 da. And then we have people rate their preference for those things in the preference version of the wave. We have tried asking people then to make ratings of each of those objects in terms of how happy versus sad is it, how lively, dreary, these kinds of emotional reactions sort of things, and it doesn't do nearly as well. But the data, when you look at the emotion data, there's a lot of them that seem to be so strongly driven by particular associations, like the thing angry. So it's dark and saturated red, and it falls off for the lighter and more muted reds, and then it falls off as a function of difference from red. Remember, there's a circular dimension, so purple has a reddish quality. It actually wraps around, right? So you can really account for almost all of the variance of this just in terms of the distance between this one very, very salient example, like, blood, which co-determines the face that gets red when you're angry, and the result of anger when there's injury and things like that. And a lot of these other ones are similar to that. Calm with blue, and where's some of the other ones? Courageous also with red, and so forth. So I have a feeling that there is a story to be told that's based on associations. But it's probably primarily driven by a few very salient examples. That's my guess. Yeah.
I have a friend who has some number theoretical synesthetic effects.
Oh, yeah.
Give him a number and he can tell you.
Yeah, there's lots of
colors.
people that have
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
So I wonder, is this what happens when you start looking at that?
We have.
And are those effects, which seem far more arbitrary to me, in fact correlated between people who report
Yeah.
this effect?
So we've actually done this task, not with numbers, but with alphanumeric characters. We include numbers, right?
You're talking about one that use synesthetic subjects.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
I
haven't
mean,
done it with
there are
synesthetic.
other studies that actually look at comparing different synesthetes and whether or not they have the same associations, and it looks to be pretty idiosyncratic.
It does, but there are statistical regularities, as
Yeah.
David Eagleman
Yeah,
has
David
has
Eagleman
a
is the
huge
guy who does that.
database on the computer. If you like Google synesthesia, it should pop, very close to the top.
He actually
we
owns
did-
synesthete.org. Yeah.
Okay, there you go, synesthete.org. We did a similar experiment to the ones that I told you about, where we show people the single alphanumeric characters and have them pick the 3 colors that go best with that letter and so forth. And there are non-random relationships between the data. They tend to be, like I said, you can think about it in terms of an idiosyncratic component and some sort of more systematic component. So if there is a statistical tendency, even among synesthetes, for example, for B to be preferentially blue, or G to be preferentially green, because the word begins with that letter and so forth. And those sorts of things seem to come out to some degree in the normal population as well. I mean, if you send me an email, I'm sepalmer@gmail.com, I can send you the poster that's about that. They're not hugely compelling data, but there are relationships there.
Why don't we stop now and feed these guys some lunch, and rest can welcome to join if you want.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you.